Okay, this is the back end of Chapter 6, and what we're going to be talking about is evolution and natural selection. We've taken our time walking through the various biomes in lecture, and we've talked about the abiotic conditions that shape those biomes, things such as latitude, sunlight, temperature, annual precipitation, mineral and organic content of the soil, and the effect that this has on the living components of the ecosystem is to provide a selection pressure such that organisms best fit to survive in that particular environment are the ones most likely to live long enough in order to reproduce. So we're going to define what evolution is, and we'll explain how evolution by natural selection consists of 4 observations of the natural world, and we'll describe the various types of evidence that support evolution. So what I'd like you to do first is, if you'll go onto Blackboard, in the video content area, you'll find a video entitled Evolution and Natural Selection. And what I'd like you to do is to watch that video now. It runs in Real Player. Okay. In light of what you just viewed, we can describe the course of evolution in miniature if we look at a single species and the effects of natural selection on physical, biochemical, and physiological characteristics within a single species over time. What we're looking at here are Darwin's finches in miniature. Darwin sailed the HMS Beagle around the Pacific Ocean and Atlantic Ocean, and eventually he came to the Galapagos Islands, where he described the physical adaptations that the native finches had in each of these islands with regard to their food source. And he found that the finches were uniquely adapted to the food source available on those islands. This evidence that he observed and categorized gave him some of the starting material to formulate the theory of evolution, which he detailed in his landmark book, An Origin of Species. So if we go back in time a bit before Darwin arrived on the Galapagos, the probable sequence of events began with an ancestral species of finches that lived in South America, probably in or around Ecuador. What happened is that these birds migrated to the Galapagos Islands. The ancestral species reached the Galapagos quite some time before Darwin arrived. And modern species descended from those ancestral species. Some of the examples of physical adaptations and physiological adaptations included changes in behavior and changes in the types of beaks on these finches that were adapted to the food sources that were available on each of these individual islands. The large ground finch had a beak that was designed to break hard seeds and get the nutritional value out of those particular foodstuffs, whereas the small ground finch fed primarily on soft seeds, and you can see that there is a substantially different beak on this particular bird than on the large ground finch. The woodpecker finch was adapted to feed on insects, while the medium ground finch primarily fed on moderate seeds, the warbler finch feeding on insects, and the cactus finch feeding on the cactus. Again, what Darwin noted is that these finches had behaviors and physical adaptations designed for them to take advantage of a particular foodstuff. The apparently related species on the Galapagos have different beak shapes and different diets. Darwin reasoned that the finches that colonized from the mainland had changed as the birds, now geographically isolated from each other, adapted to their different diets. And we can go even further today to help lend support to Darwin's theory if we were to extract genetic material from each of these finch descendants and compare it to the ancestral finch, the supposed ancestral finch, what we would find is that the degree of similarity in the genetic material between these finches and the ancestral finch is much higher than the degree of DNA similarity between these descendant finches and other finch species that were not the progenitors or the supposed progenitors of these phenotypes that currently populate the Galapagos. Essentially, what we're saying with evolution is that there is a finite amount of a particular resource. A resource could be food, could be shelter, could be an area to breed, could be a lot of things. And organisms have to compete for those resources in order to survive. Organisms cannot share a particular resource in limited quantity because there's not enough of that resource to support all the different organisms that might want to take advantage of it. As a result, in the course of competition, adaptations occur which result from within breeding populations selecting for those physical characteristics that provide the greatest advantage for those organisms to survive long enough to make it to reproductive age and to reproduce. When that happens, the genetic material that's responsible for those physical and physiological adaptations is going to be overrepresented in the subsequent generations, while the genetic material that's maladaptive is going to become less frequent. And as a result, you will essentially, over time, and as these adaptations mount, generate an entirely new species. A species is defined as a group of organisms that can interbreed and produce fertile offspring. There are many finches in the world today, but only finches of a particular species are capable of mating and reproducing and generating fertile offspring. These finches, for instance, in all likelihood would not be able to interbreed in order to produce now a novel species or a fertile species or fertile offspring. So let's take a look at our next concept check. And what we have here is a simple question: what is evolution? And it's defined as the cumulative genetic changes in a population that occur during successive generations as a result of natural selection. What four observations are the basis of natural selection? And these are the surplus reproductive capacity of many species, heritable variation, meaning the information in the genetic material which is passed from the parents to the offspring in sexual reproduction, the limits on population growth, or a struggle for existence, and then finally, differential reproductive success. So this is a very important thing to understand. Within any sexually reproducing population, because of the nature of sexual reproduction, as well as the fact that as a result of exposure to environmental conditions and other factors, you can create variability within the genetic material that produces physical changes in those populations. So you can even look around our classroom and see that while we're all human beings, we all have slight physical and, if we were to look deeper, biochemical and physiological differences. And this is the result of sexual reproduction. Part of sexual reproduction includes a reshuffling of the genetic material at meiosis, when the sperm and the eggs are made, and as a result of fertilization, a novel combination of genes that produces offspring that, while similar in many respects to the parents, also have unique physical and biochemical characteristics independent of either parent. That increases the diversity within the population, and that's the raw material upon which evolution acts. In addition to this, there are mutations that occur as a result of the replication of DNA per se, as well as the exposure to mutating forces in the environment, things such as viruses, mutagenic chemicals, mutagenic forms of energy such as ionizing radiation. All of these can produce changes in the genetic material. And it's these changes, these slight changes, that natural selection acts upon in order to pick out those physical, behavioral, biochemical characteristics that are going to be best adapted to survive in this environment. What types of evidence support evolution? Well, it's supported by observation from the fossil record, comparative anatomy, biogeography, and molecular biology. Essentially, the observations from the fossil record record morphological adaptations, changes in body shape and body plan that provide an advantage for organisms within a specific environmental niche. Comparative anatomy is simply the observation that within a given body plan, modifications can accumulate that can result in fundamental changes in physical structure that adapt particular organisms for a competitive advantage within a particular environment. As an example, if you were to look at the flipper of a whale and you were to put it under an x-ray machine, what you would find are bones that make up fingers and bones that make up the palm of the hand if you're looking at the front flippers. Yet the flipper itself is covered entirely with tissue, and the shape is designed to propel that animal through water. And the thinking is that originally these extensions, these appendages, were adapted primarily for use on land because of the bone structure. But as a result of natural selection, we have modified that body plan in order to compete within, in this case, an aquatic environment. Biogeography is another example. This is where populations can become physically isolated from each other, and as a result of the differing selective pressures within different geographic regions, we can now observe the emergence of populations with slightly different physical, biochemical, and physiological characteristics that are adapted for that particular environment. And the evidence from molecular biology is quite strong. Basically, if we look at genetic material from current species and compare them to presumptive ancestors, what we find is a relationship in terms of similarity of information that allows us to draw what we call a clade or a tree of supposed changes over evolutionary time from progenitors to modern species. We've done this with quite a large variety of current organisms. If we look, for instance, at the clade for man, what we find is that our closest relative currently is the chimpanzee, and on the basis simply of DNA similarity. So it's thought that the common ancestor between the man and the chimp was something that occurred more recently in time than, say, the common ancestor between man and, say, a rodent. Now, as we move on, one of the things that we want to understand is not only do organisms themselves change their characteristics over time as a response to natural selection, but communities themselves can change over time as a result of both abiotic and biotic change, and this is called succession. What we're going to do is define it, and then we're going to distinguish between primary and secondary succession. So what is ecological succession? And it's the process of community development over time through a sequence of species. Organisms colonize an area and others replace them, and then other organisms replace those colonizing organisms. Mature communities have longer lived species which give the appearance of an unchanging state or a climax. In reality, there is no climax because communities continually change as a result of changes in abiotic components as well as biotic components within an ecosystem. So even though it looks to us from moment to moment that a particular ecosystem is basically the same. The fact of the matter is that change is constantly going on. That's the nature of ecosystems, because one component of ecosystems are living organisms, and living organisms constantly change as their environments change. So let's take a peek at primary succession. Henry Cowles, back in the 1880s, studied the Michigan sand dunes. And what he noticed is that there were changes of species over a time in a previously uninhabited environment. Now, let's give Mr. Cowles the benefit of the doubt here. That environment probably wasn't completely uninhabited. There were probably microbes within that environment. So to say that it's completely barren of life is probably a misapprehension here. But in terms of organisms that he was aware of, it was probably relatively uninhabited. There was no soil and there were bare rock surfaces. And a pioneer community began the ecological succession in this region. He noticed that lichens began to break up rocks and form soil. Now you might ask, well, what the heck is a lichen? Well, if you've ever looked at an old granite building or an old sidewalk, you might notice a pale green, flat, disc-shaped growth on some of these rocks. And what that growth is a lichen. A lichen is a symbiotic relationship between a fungus and an algae, and it's one of the hallmark pioneering species in succession. The algae gives the lichen its green color, and the algae is capable of photosynthesis, so it can take carbon dioxide and water from the air, and it can convert it into chemical potential energy in the form of starch, basically sugars. The lichen has another component, and that is the fungus. The fungus provides a home for the algae, so it keeps it safe, keeps it protected, while the algae provides nutrition for the fungus. So this is, in a sense, a self-contained organism. Let's not say organism, let's say a self-contained organismal relationship that can serve as a pioneering community, because as the lichen dies, what happens is it decomposes. The decomposition is triggered by other microbes. As the lichens begin to break down, they introduce an organic component to bare rock, and that organic component can serve to increase the fertility of the soil or the surface on which it grows. As the lichens begin to break down the rock and then decay themselves, they begin to convert the soil from primarily a collection of minerals to having an organic component, having soluble nitrogenous compounds and soluble carbon compounds within this new soil. So they begin to break up the rocks, they begin to form the soil. The next organisms that are seen in terms of being able to observe these with your eyes, not with a microscope, are mosses and drought-resistant ferns, and then later grasses and herbs. Lastly come shrubs, which are followed by forest trees. And so we can see an example of this here. This is primary succession on a glacial moraine. During the past 200 years, glaciers have retreated in Glacier Bay, Alaska. Although these photos were not taken in the same area, they show the same stages of primary succession on a glacial moraine. We move from rocks and gravel, as you can see here, and sand that a glacier deposits, and then we begin to see plant growth. Notice that the spruce trees do not establish a community until sufficient organic nutrients have entered the soil from preceding colonizing species. So here we see the initial glacial retreat. Lichens begin to grow, they colonize the barren landscape, and then the mosses and shrubs move in. Later, dwarf trees and shrubs colonize the area, so you get a little bit of primary productivity here. Well, again, as primary productivity in ecosystem picks up, what do we see next? We see primary and secondary consumers, and eventually we see top predators, and we start to see now the development of a complex food web. At a later point, spruces dominate the community, Now we see lots of primary productivity and a much more complex ecosystem. And so this is a perfect example of what we were saying earlier in the class when I was trying to impress upon you the fact that life will fill a vacuum. Basically, ecosystems are always subjected to stresses and strains, but there will always be some type of organism that can make a living within these apparently barren areas of the world. A perfect example is to look at the Utah salt flats. Um, Essentially, what you've got are acres and acres of land that's covered with mineral salts, and it's a very harsh environment, has very little water. Yet, if you look very closely at the Utah salt flats, what you'll find are little splotches of purple growth on the soil and on the rocks. And if you examine these little bits of purple growth, what you'll find is that these are a type of bacteria called halobacteria. Halobacteria, the name is given them because they're able to exist in extremely moisture poor environments. They tolerate high salinity. Their purple color comes from the fact that they synthesize a pigment called rhodopsin, which has the capability in these organisms of fixing light from the sun, water from the air, and carbon dioxide from the air into complex sugars and allowing them now to live in this extremely hostile environment. As a result, they set the stage now for other organisms eventually to come in and change that ecosystem. In secondary succession, we see changes in species composition after a disturbance in an area that was previously inhabited. Examples include abandoned farmland or areas that have been ravaged by fire or logging. The soil is already present, as is very well studied thanks to extensive records that have been taken. In the southeastern U.S., an example is crabgrass communities giving rise to horseweed communities, giving rise to pine trees, and eventually hardwood trees. And here you can see a perfect example taken from North Carolina. This is an abandoned field. Okay? Notice that the annual and perennial weeds become established after sufficient organic nutrients have entered the soil from previous colonizing species. And so what you see now is a change in the community over time until we have what we call the climax community, which in fact is in a kind of dynamic equilibrium, constantly changing. Okay? None of this stuff is ever static, even though to us it appears to be. So we get to our next block of concept check questions. First question, what is ecological succession? And it's the process of community development over time, and this involves species in one stage being replaced by different species. Next question, how does primary succession differ from secondary succession? Primary succession is the change in species composition over time in a previously uninhabited environment, or let's be as accurate as we can, a minimally inhabited environment, such as bare rock surfaces formed by volcanic lava and or glacial retreat. Secondary succession is the change in species composition that takes place after some disturbance destroys the existing vegetation, but the previous soil has remained. So now we get to our case study for this chapter, and what we're looking at here are wildfires. A wildfire is any unexpected and unwanted fire that burns in grass, shrub, and forest areas. But it's an important environmental force. It does, however, disturb the ecosystem. But the combustion frees up nutrients and removes plant cover and stimulates seed germination. In fact, there are some species of plants that cannot sprout unless they've actually experienced intense heat. That's the result of a wildfire. This increases soil erosion, and hundreds of new wildfires each day occur at the peak of fire season. It is a natural part of the environment. There's many ecosystems that are adapted to fire, but human fire prevention has made it worse. This allows debris to accumulate, making the fires hotter and much more destructive. So you can see here an aerial shot of a wildfire This is taken from the west coast, and we can zoom in here and see the fire itself raging. Okay, that brings us to the end of this chapter. Be sure and review this material for the upcoming exam, as components of it will be on the test, and I will see everybody in class. Thank you.